Hi. Today I'm looking at Exodus chapter 23, verses 10 through 19. So here we find the instructions for rest and return to God pertaining to crops and giving back to God out of our abundance. These laws were given to the Jews in the wilderness as they waited for the promised land. So they had been delivered out of Egypt, and now they're just kind of in the wilderness, and God is giving the law to them. But the laws had great significance, and I think we're able to draw more than a few parallels in our own lives to these practices that God gave them. So we'll just look at them a little closer. In verses 10 and 11, we'll just read those, and it says, "For 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its yield, but in the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, that the poor of your people may eat, and what they leave, the beasts of the field may eat. You shall do likewise with your vineyard and with your olive orchard." Okay, so that's 10 and 11, and here we find the principle of a sabbatical year for growing. For 6 years, the people of God were to sow their fields, and the 7th year, they were to let it rest. Okay, and so they weren't to plant, they weren't to reap or keep anything that the ground produced on its own that year for themselves. They were to allow others to take it, be it animals or just poor people. They were to allow them to have that portion. So in the 6th year, that meant in the 6th year they had to store up for 2 years, because in the 7th year they were not permitted to reap or sow or reap. Okay, so here we have a fundamental teaching that God gave from the very beginning of working 6 days and resting on the 7th. And we find that once again in verse 12. It says, 6 days you shall do your work, but on the 7th day you shall rest, that your ox and your donkey may have rest, and the son of your servant woman and the alien may be refreshed. Okay, so God's doing this for a couple of reasons. He's providing for the poor, and he is causing his people to rest and trust in him during this time. Okay, so the main idea that we ought to take away from this, other than what I just said, is that rest and refreshment is necessary for all living things, be it people, animals, or even the earth itself. And we know this. Taking 1 day every week or 1 year every 7, as they were commanded to here, from our work to simply rest, to trust in God's provision, it's a constant reminder that our strength and our portion and our needs for food, for shelter, for clothing, for all of our basic necessities, and even the ability to obtain those things through our own labor, those things are all given by God. So he wants us to stop, rest, and remember, and give a return to him as well. Okay, and then that's why he stops in verse 13 is like my favorite verse in this whole passage. It's really kind of neat. He stops after he says this about the resting, before he goes into the return, where the people were commanded to come back and have these feasts where they bring back a portion of what they have obtained from the earth. He stops in between the rest and the return, and he says this in verse 13: "Pay attention to all that I have said to you, and make no mention of the names of other gods, nor let it be heard on your lips." Now that's interesting, because he stops right smack dab in the middle, and he's like, "Hey guys, pay attention." It's like I feel like I'm a school teacher here again. He's stopping, he's saying, pay attention. This must be really important, because God already has their attention, right? He's giving the law to Moses, and Moses is relaying it to the people. But he says, pay attention. What are we to pay attention to, or what were they to pay attention to? It says, the imperative here is not just to pay attention, but to pay attention to God's words. Pay attention to all that I have said to you. Um, what a thing to consider for us, right? Pay attention to God's words, to his word, Jesus Christ. Pay attention to this word, the Bible. Pay attention to everything that I've said, and you will have rest, right? This is important. It's very, very important. So if every believer today would heed this instruction, we'd be in better shape in the church, wouldn't we? So listen to God, pay attention. And the idea to which he was pointing here was idolatry, to avoid all other gods. They were not even to speak about the practices, the traditions, the pagan traditions, the pagan religions. Don't even talk about those things. Pay attention to me. This is what God is saying. And he stops right in the middle of his law giving to say this, in the middle of his rest and return. And there's a reason for that. So important was this instruction on idolatry that he stops in the middle of his giving of the law of resting and returning to say so. It's because other gods, now get this, because this is us. This is Western culture in America in 2017. He says this because other gods, idols, be they material, relational, spiritual, otherwise, other gods, things we put in front of God, those things are exactly what's going to cause us to not pay attention to God, to not rest, to not give a return to him. Those are the things that are going to keep us from obeying these commands and these laws. So think about it. If I'm serving another god, let's say a material god, I want these things, I covet these things, and I want them. I'm going to do whatever it takes to get them. I'm going to work every single day overtime and spend time away from my family to get them, and I'm going to spend all I have on them, and I'm not going to give a return to God. I'm not going to rest because I want something that has my heart that isn't God, an idol. Okay, so it causes us to work nonstop, to keep all we produce for ourselves, to never rest, to never let our workers or our animals even rest, to never let our fields rest, as we're commanded to not give to the poor. That's what this causes, and to not give back to God, who gave us even the ability to even work and labor to get our own provision. So little wonder why God, tells them here essentially, but also us to pay attention. Pay attention here. Don't serve idols. Don't even speak their names. Don't think about those things, because it's going to lead you astray and keep you from rest. And you need rest. We know that. So in moving on, verses 14 through 17, God commands a return 3 times a year. The men were to come before him and bring a portion back to him at these 3 points in time. They were set aside on the calendar year for these feasts and festivals. And so one was the Feast of Unleavened Bread, one was the Feast of Harvest, also known as the Feast of Weeks, and the last was the Feast of Ingathering, or the Feast of Tabernacles, Feast of Booths. And the significance here is worth noting as well. So the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the people were to remember their deliverance out of Egypt. It was celebrated in the month of Abib when they came out of slavery by God's hand. And the unleavened bread pointed to the provision of bread which rained down from heaven for them. So no one was to come to this feast empty-handed. The feast began the day after Pentecost. And so Pentecost was not what we know Pentecost as Christians. Back then it was called Shavuot. I don't know if I'm saying that right. But so Christians know Pentecost as where the Spirit was given. But in the Old Testament, the Jews knew this holiday as the Feast of Weeks, a time which we're going to talk about next. But it was a time of harvest and a time of first fruits, and bringing first fruits back to God. So there's an unmistakable correlation there between the Old Testament practices and the New Testament spiritual realities. If Jesus' death and resurrection and the Holy Spirit's subsequent work at Pentecost was the first fruits, which we know that it was, we would expect what follows to be something that would point back to the deliverance that made those things possible. And that something is the preaching of the gospel, which points back to the cross. So the preaching of the gospel points us always and ever back to the cross, which is our deliverance out of slavery and out of bondage to sin. So that's, just as they were celebrating their deliverance out of Egypt, it just foreshadowed and pointed to our deliverance from sin. And so just so no one, as no one could come to the Feast of Unleavened Bread empty-handed, no one can come to the true bread of heaven, Jesus Christ, without giving their very life. So here we have some correlations. Okay, so secondly, God instituted the Feast of Weeks. This was a feast at harvest time. This is when they brought the first fruits of what they had sown to the house of God. And just as they were to bring the first and the best of what they obtained from the earth and of their labor, we are to do the same. God never allowed his people to keep all they had for themselves or to keep the best of what they had for themselves. We're to rest, we're to give back to him and to others, and in doing so, we remember who the giver is, and we are thankful. And lastly, the feast mentioned here was the Feast of Tabernacles, the Feast of Ingathering, the Feast of Booths. The gathering was at the year's end, and they were commanded to live in temporary structures for a week. And it was to remind them that though they produced much and were at the end of the abundance for the year, that everything given to them and us here on earth is temporary. It's just temporary, just like the structures they were commanded to live in for this feast. The idea was that they were not to keep back the last portion for themselves out of fear or worry about the months ahead, which wouldn't have a return or any reaping, but to trust in God for their provision once again. And also the temporary nature of it, whatever they got from their harvest could not be held on to forever. So they were to keep these things at the forefront, and that's why God instituted these particular kind of feasts. It was to remind them. And also that God is the sustainer of all things, including our very lives. So, and lastly, at this feast, it was a time of the reading of the law, and I think that just kind of points to the fact that it's when we're most blessed that we're most likely to forget God and His requirements. So, just wrapping up. Lastly, the people of God were instructed once again on the kind of bread and the kind of sacrifice they were to offer. This reminds us that we cannot worship God just any way we want to. And we can't just worship any God. It had to be unleavened bread. And that unleavened bread pointed to the bread of heaven. And that is Jesus Christ, of course. So there was a specific kind of bread and a specific way that they had to offer their sacrifice. And that is found in verse number 18. And so it is Jesus Christ alone whom we must bring to the altar with us. And we must offer ourselves in the way in which He commands. Okay. So the very last instruction here is found in verse 19. And the people were told in verse 19 not to boil a young goat in its mother's milk, which seems kind of strange. But this was a superstition from a pagan religion that people were practicing then. And it said that if one did this and then sprinkled the milk over the fields, that their fields would produce a better harvest the following year. So they were not to do this. It just points to the fact that God's people were not to have anything to do with superstition, pagan religion, false religion, idol worship, or the like. And so, of course, that principle is still true for us today. Okay, so just to sum it all up, basically this passage teaches us to pay attention to these things, to resting, to giving back to God, returning to God. And so rest, remember God, and return the best of what He gives to us back to Him.